Everyone in the studio was staring at the envelope, a simple, cream-colored envelope with handwriting that seemed to shake as it was penned. But no one noticed what I noticed, the way Dr. Phil's hands were trembling as he held it. In 30 years of television, through thousands of confrontations, confessions, and revelations, I had never seen his hands shake like that. "Stop the tape." The words cut through the studio like a blade. Cameras stopped mid-zoom. The audience, which had been leaning forward with anticipation, froze. Production assistants looked at each other, uncertain whether they'd heard correctly. Dr. Phil McGraw, the man who had built an empire on never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting emotion override his clinical detachment, had just broken his own cardinal rule. He stood up slowly from his chair, the envelope still clutched in his right hand, and walked toward the edge of the stage. Not toward his guest, not toward the audience, just away, toward the darkness where the cameras couldn't follow. "Phil," the voice came from somewhere off camera. Robin, his wife of 47 years, sitting in her usual spot in the front row. He didn't turn around. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath that everyone could see, but nobody could hear. And in that moment of absolute silence, something unprecedented happened on the Dr. Phil show. The host became human. But to understand why that envelope shattered 3 decades of professional armor, we have to go back to where this story really began. 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Phil's production team received an email through the show's official submission portal. It was brief, almost clinical in its detachment, which is probably why it caught the attention of the senior producers, who see thousands of desperate pleas every week. "My name is Sarah McGraw. I'm Dr. Phil's daughter. He hasn't spoken to me in 11 years. I have something he needs to hear, and I'll only say it on his show in front of everyone. If he wants to know why I disappeared, he'll agree to this." The production office erupted into controlled chaos. Dr. Phil had 2 sons from his first marriage, Jay and Jordan. They were public figures, frequently mentioned on the show, involved in the business. But a daughter? There was no daughter in the public record. No mention in biographies, no family photos, no social media trail. The senior producer, a woman named Patricia, who had worked with Dr. Phil since the inception of the show in 2002, walked the printed email into his private office. She didn't knock. Their relationship had evolved beyond such formalities. "Phil, you need to see this." He was reviewing questions for the next day's taping, his reading glasses perched on his nose, that familiar look of intense concentration on his face. He glanced up, took the paper, and his expression didn't change as he read it. Not a flicker, not a flinch. But Patricia had worked with him long enough to know. The way he set the paper down, too carefully, too precisely, told her everything. "It's real," he said quietly. "Not a question, a statement." "Is it?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, "Schedule her. Front row seat. No pre-inter. No preparation. If she wants to do this publicly, we'll do it publicly." Patricia hesitated. "Phil, this could be—" "I know what it could be." His voice was steady, clinical. The same voice he used when delivering hard truths to guests who weren't ready to hear them. "Schedule her." But what Dr. Phil didn't tell Patricia, what he didn't tell anyone, was that he'd been waiting for this moment for 11 years. Waiting for the phone call, the letter, the confrontation. Waiting for his daughter to come back. The day of the taping arrived with a peculiar tension in the studio. The production crew knew something was different, even if they didn't know what. Dr. Phil was quieter than usual during makeup. He declined his usual pre-show coffee, and when he walked onto the stage to begin the taping, There was something in his eyes that the most observant members of the audience would later describe as dread. The show's opening segment featured a couple struggling with addiction, standard fare for the program, devastating personal stories, clinical intervention, resources provided. Dr. Phil moved through the interview with his characteristic blend of empathy and directness. To anyone watching at home, it would seem like a typical episode, but those in the studio could sense it. The way his eyes kept drifting to the front row, to an empty seat that had been specifically reserved. The way his responses, usually so quick and incisive, came with a half-second delay, as if part of his mind was somewhere else entirely. 40 minutes into the taping, during a planned commercial break, a young woman entered through the audience entrance. She was in her late 20s, wearing jeans and a simple blouse, deliberately casual in a room full of people who dressed up for television. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She looked like she had walked in from a different world, one where TV studios and celebrity fathers didn't exist. She took her seat in the front row, the reserved seat. When the cameras came back on, Dr. Phil's gaze found her immediately. For 3 seconds, an eternity in television time, they locked eyes. Neither smiled, neither looked away. The audience, not yet aware of what was happening, continued to focus on the couple on stage. "Before we continue," Dr. Phil said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that had become his trademark, "I need to address something else, something personal." The couple on stage glanced at each other, confused. This wasn't in the script. "I've spent 22 years of my life on television helping other people fix their families, helping parents reconnect with their children, helping daughters understand their fathers, and fathers understand their daughters." He paused, and in that pause the studio began to realize something extraordinary was happening. "But there's something I've never talked about publicly, someone I've never talked about publicly. I need to address that now." He turned to face the front row directly. "Sarah, would you come up here?" The audience erupted in whispers. Cameras swiveled to capture the young woman as she stood, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. She walked up the steps to the stage with steady, deliberate movements. No hesitation, no fear. A production assistant quickly arranged a chair across from Phil's. Sarah sat down, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight. She looked directly at him, and there was something in her eyes. Not anger, not pain, but a kind of tired resolution. "For those watching," Dr. Phil said, his clinical voice starting to crack at the edges, "this is Sarah. She's my daughter, and I haven't seen her or spoken to her in 11 years. The audience went completely silent. Not the orchestrated silence of dramatic television, but the genuine, uncomfortable silence of people witnessing something they weren't sure they should be seeing. "Why are you here?" Dr. Phil asked, following back into his professional mode, the mode that had protected him through thousands of confrontations. "Because you never came looking for me." 5 words, simple, devastating, delivered without malice, without drama, just fact. "That's not," he started, but she raised her hand gently, stopping him. "I'm not here to blame you. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because there's something you don't know, something I need you to hear, and something the world needs to understand about the man who gives advice for a living." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. The cream-colored envelope that would minutes later cause Dr. Phil to stop the cameras for the first time in his career.
"Before I give you this," she said, "I need to tell you how we got here, because the people watching need to understand that even Dr. Phil, the man who fixes everyone else, couldn't fix his own family." And that's when everyone in the studio realized they weren't watching a show anymore. They were watching a real family's reckoning happening live, unscripted, and completely raw. Sarah took a breath and began. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that made every word feel weighted with years of accumulated pain. I was 14 when my parents divorced. Not you and Mom, you and your first wife. I was the daughter from a relationship you had before your career took off, before television, before Dr. Phil became a brand. My mom wasn't Robin. My mom was a woman you met in grad school, someone you don't talk about in interviews, someone who doesn't exist in your public history. Dr. Phil's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. When you and Mom split, you were already building your practice in Texas. You had joint custody every other weekend, alternating holidays. And you tried. I'll give you that. For the first couple years, you really tried. But then the Oprah thing happened, the book deal, the show, and suddenly every other weekend became once a month. Once a month became phone calls. Phone calls became text messages. And then on my 16th birthday, the text messages stopped. In the audience, people were visibly emotional. Some women were crying, men were staring at their hands. The couple who'd been on stage minutes earlier sat forgotten in the side chairs, their own problems suddenly feeling small. I didn't disappear, Dad. You did. The word Dad landed like a physical blow. It was the first time she'd called him that, and everyone could see it register on his face. But here's what you need to understand, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. I didn't come here to make you feel guilty. I came here because 11 years ago, when I was 18 and you missed my high school graduation, I made a decision. I decided that if you could compartmentalize your life, if you could be Dr. Phil the helper while being Phil McGraw the absent father, then I could compartmentalize too. I could cut you out cleanly, completely, and build a life without you. And you did, Dr. Phil said quietly. It wasn't a question. I did. I went to college. I became a social worker. I got married. I built a career helping at-risk teenagers, kids from broken homes, kids with absent parents. And I was good at it, really good, because I understood their pain in a way my colleagues never could. She paused, and something shifted in her expression. The resolution cracked just slightly, letting through what was underneath. Grief. But 3 months ago, something happened that changed everything. Something that made me realize I couldn't keep pretending you didn't exist. She held up the envelope. This is why I'm here. This is what you need to know. Dr. Phil reached for it, but she pulled it back slightly. Before I give this to you, I need you to understand something. For 11 years, I convinced myself I didn't need you. I built a whole identity around not needing you. And then this happened, and I realized I was lying to myself. She extended the envelope again, and this time he took it. His hands, those famous hands that had pointed at thousands of guests, that had gestured emphatically to make points about accountability and truth, were shaking. Open it, she said softly. The camera zoomed in as Dr. Phil's fingers worked the envelope flap. Inside was a single photograph. He pulled it out, looked at it, and the transformation that occurred on his face was instant and complete. The clinical detachment evaporated. The professional armor cracked. Dr. Phil McGraw, who had stared down addicts, abusers, and manipulators without flinching, stared at that photograph and broke. Her name is Emma, Sarah said, her own voice cracking now. She's 2 years old. She has your eyes and your stubborn chin. And she has a congenital heart condition that requires surgery. Surgery we've been trying to afford for 6 months. The audience gasped collectively. Some women were crying. Men were staring at their hands. The couple who'd been on stage minutes earlier sat forgotten in the side chairs, their own problems suddenly feeling small. I didn't disappear, Dad. You did. We figured out the financial part. I came here because 3 nights ago, my daughter looked at me and asked, Mommy, why don't I have a grandpa like other kids? And that's when Dr. Phil stood up, walked toward the edge of the stage, and said the words that stopped everything. Stop the tape. The command was absolute. Cameras went dark. The audience sat in stunned silence. Dr. Phil stood at the edge of the stage, still holding the photograph, his back to everyone. Robin McGraw appeared from the audience, climbing the steps to the stage, something she'd never done in 22 years of the show. She didn't go to her husband. She went to Sarah. "May I?" Robin asked gently, gesturing to the chair beside her. Sarah nodded, tears streaming freely. Now Robin sat beside her and took her hand. Dr. Phil turned back toward them, the photograph still in his grip. His eyes were red, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "I can't undo 11 years. I can't get back the time I missed, but I can be here now." He looked directly at Sarah. "I can meet my granddaughter, and I can be the father and grandfather I should have been all along." He walked to Sarah and knelt beside her chair, a gesture no one had ever seen from him. The man who stood above his guests, who maintained authority through position, was now on his knees. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words he'd coached thousands to say, but rarely said himself. "I failed you, and I want to try again." Sarah reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. That's all I needed to hear. The audience rose to their feet, not in applause, but in witness. They were watching a broken family take its first steps toward healing. Off camera, producers wiped tears. Crew members who had worked on the show for decades would later say it was the most important moment they'd ever captured. Because that day, Dr. Phil taught his most powerful lesson, not through advice, but through action. Sometimes the hardest person to help is yourself. And sometimes admitting you failed is the first step toward making it right. 3 months later, Emma's surgery was successful. And at her bedside, holding her small hand as she recovered, was a grandfather she just met. One who promised never to disappear again. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.